In the autumn of 1868, amid the quiet farmlands of western Pennsylvania, a 9-year-old boy named Timothy Vale became the most unsettling mystery ever documented in the annals of early American medicine. He did not cry when his parents died. He did not speak for 3 days after being found wandering barefoot through the ashes of his family's farmhouse, and when he finally did, the words he chose would haunt the men who heard them for the rest of their lives. Dr. Edwin Harding, the region's leading physician and a veteran of the war, recorded every encounter in a set of journals now locked away in the archives of the Pennsylvania Medical College. Those pages describe a child whose intelligence seemed unnatural and whose lack of emotion defied everything the science of the time could explain. For 6 months, a series of accidents followed wherever Timothy was kept. Nurses dead by drowning, livestock mutilated, and one doctor driven to madness. When the asylum that housed the boy finally burned to the ground in the winter of 1869, no trace of Timothy Vale was ever found. For more than a century, his name was buried, erased from medical records, whispered only by those who claim to have seen the same pale eyes in their dreams. What remains of his story is not merely a tale of tragedy, but a question that still chills every rational mind that dares to face it. Is evil born or made? Before we begin the descent into the lost case of Timothy Vale, the boy science couldn't explain, make sure to subscribe to the Macabre Record channel and ring the bell so you never miss our explorations into history's darkest enigmas. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Our growing community of seekers and skeptics spans the world, and we'd love to know where the shadows reach tonight. The story begins not with horror, but with quiet. The Vale family's farm sat 3 miles outside the town of Mill Creek, a small settlement scarred by the Civil War's aftermath. Most men had returned broken or not at all, and their wives worked the land with children barely old enough to hold a plough. On the morning of October 3rd, a column of black smoke rose from the direction of the Vale property. Neighbors arrived too late. The house had collapsed inward, its timbers charred to the bone. Inside, 2 bodies, identified as Elias and Mary Vale, were found near the hearth. No sign of their son. That evening, Sheriff Kavanaugh led a search through the fields and riverbanks. They found Timothy at dawn, standing barefoot in the frost. His clothes were spotless, his hair brushed neatly, his hands clasped behind his back. When the sheriff asked what happened, the boy tilted his head and said softly, "It was very quiet when the fire started." Dr. Harding was summoned before sunrise. He would later write that when he first met the boy, the child's expression carried the calm of a surgeon, not the sorrow of an orphan. Dr. Edwin Harding examined the boy that same morning in his small practice behind the courthouse. The room smelled of carbolic acid and lamp oil, a sterile contrast to the cold earth still clinging to Timothy's bare feet. The doctor expected shock, hysteria, the vacant stare of a traumatized child. Instead, Timothy sat quietly on the examination table, eyes fixed on the clock's pendulum as though timing its every swing. "Do you remember the fire?" Harding asked, his tone measured, almost gentle. "Yes," the boy replied without inflection. "It was loud first, then soft, then gone." Harding paused, unsure whether to continue. "Did you try to wake your parents?" Timothy looked at him with mild curiosity, as if the question itself were strange. "They were already awake," he said, "just not moving." The physician noted the calmness of his voice, the absence of tremor or confusion. Pulse steady, pupils normal, skin unblemished despite the proximity to the blaze. "Remarkably composed," Harding wrote later in his journal. "No visible fear response, no tear production, speech deliberate, unhurried, and adult." He attempted a series of simple neurological tests. Timothy followed every command perfectly. Touch your nose, raise your left hand, count to 10. When asked to draw a circle on paper, he produced a flawless mathematical ring without using a guide. "He displays precision inconsistent with his age," Harding wrote, "and an intelligence that unnerves rather than impresses." Local authorities arrived mid-morning, demanding answers. The sheriff suspected foul play, but Timothy offered none. He simply said, "The house was tired." Harding dismissed him for rest, providing the sheriff with a physician's opinion that the boy was physically sound but emotionally suspended, a term he coined for patients who felt neither grief nor terror after trauma. But when he returned to his office hours later, he found Timothy still sitting on the table, staring at the clock. "You may go now, Timothy," he said. "I like the sound it makes," the boy answered. "It's like something alive that never eats." That night, Harding recorded his first doubts. "The child's composure unsettles me," he wrote. "He behaves not as one recovering from shock, but as one observing it in others. I begin to feel that he studies us." In the following days, word spread quickly through Mill Creek. Some called him cursed, others touched by God. When a pair of farmhands claimed they saw the boy standing beside the charred ruins at midnight, murmuring to the soil, Harding dismissed it as local superstition, yet he found himself locking his door for the first time in years. The sheriff urged the doctor to send the boy to an institution in Pittsburgh. Harding refused. "He is not ill," he said. "He is a question." 2 days after the fire, Dr. Harding accompanied Sheriff Kavanaugh to the Vale property to complete a formal investigation. The farmhouse still smouldered in places, a skeleton of blackened beams rising from a bed of grey ash. The scent of burned hay, resin and flesh hung heavy in the wind. Timothy remained in the carriage at the edge of the field, staring out the window, expressionless. Inside the ruins, the remains of Elias and Mary Vale were identified by fragments of jewelry and dental structure. But the doctor's experience told him something was wrong. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of struggle or panic. The couple appeared to have been sitting at the table when the fire began. The bones of Elias's hands rested calmly on the wood, as though folded in prayer. "The fire began in the hearth," Harding murmured, crouching by the remains. "But look, the chimney draught runs opposite. This blaze spread from the floorboards outward, not from the fireplace itself." The sheriff frowned. "You mean someone poured oil?" "Perhaps. But the residue is uneven. Not poured, dripped." Harding found traces of paraffin wax along the boards, small hardened trails leading toward the cellar door. When pried open, the steps below were untouched by fire. The physician's lantern illuminated an orderly collection of small glass jars, labeled with handwritten numbers. Inside each, the blackened remains of insects, frogs, and one small bird. "Experiments," Harding whispered. "Someone catalogued these." The sheriff glanced uneasily toward the carriage. "You think the boy—" Harding cut him off. "He's 9 years old." Yet the thought lingered, unwanted but immovable. When they returned outside, Timothy stood beside the fence, hands folded neatly behind his back. "Did you find them?" he asked, tone calm. Harding nodded. "We did." "I thought so," Timothy said. "They were very quiet when it happened." The doctor felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Do you remember who started the fire?" Timothy blinked, slow and deliberate. "Fires start themselves when they're ready." That evening, Harding wrote by candlelight, struggling to justify the unease growing inside him. "No ordinary delusion, no trauma response accounts for such composure," he noted. "If cruelty exists without motive, without rage or pleasure, what then is its origin? The boy displays no conscience because he knows not that one should exist." By dawn, the sheriff's men had boarded the remains of the farmhouse and declared the case inconclusive. But the doctor knew that conclusion was false. Somewhere in those ashes lay not only the Vale family's tragedy, but a question that reason itself was too afraid to answer. By the end of the week, the townspeople of Mill Creek had turned fearful curiosity into whispered condemnation. Mothers crossed the street when Timothy was led by, clutching their children close. The boy never seemed to notice. He walked with the same measured pace, his gaze distant, as though following a sound no one else could hear. Dr. Harding could no longer ignore the unease spreading through the community, or through himself. After repeated visits from the sheriff and a formal petition by the town's council, Harding agreed to escort the boy to Wexler Asylum, a private institution for the study of aberrant youth on the outskirts of Pittsburgh. The journey would take 2 days by train, crossing long stretches of barren farmland and coal country where the autumn fog hung low over the tracks. On the morning of departure, the station was almost empty. Timothy carried no belongings save for a small, soot-stained book that Harding hadn't seen before. "What's that you have?" the doctor asked. "It's a story," the boy said, "but the ending keeps changing." The remark unsettled Harding, but he said nothing. They boarded the 7:15 westbound train. The rhythmic clatter of wheels over iron filled the silence between them. Harding opened his journal to make notes, but his pen hesitated over the paper. For the first time in years, he found he did not know how to begin. Timothy turned from the window. "Do you think people can be born wrong?" The doctor looked up. "Wrong?" "Like a song played backward," the boy said simply. Harding exhaled. "No one is born wrong, Timothy. Circumstance shapes us. Pain teaches. We learn good by surviving its absence." The child smiled faintly. "I don't think I ever learned that part." For the rest of the journey, Timothy sat silently, hands folded neatly, watching the smoke drift past the window as if studying its movement. Each stop brought new passengers, though none sat near them. Harding noticed that those who tried soon shifted away, complaining of drafts or a strange heaviness in the air. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Timothy spoke again, his voice low and steady. "Dr. Harding, do you ever dream when you're awake?" The doctor glanced at him. "What do you mean?" "Sometimes I see things before they happen." "Not dreams exactly, more like memories that haven't happened yet." Harding felt his throat tighten. "And what do you see now?" Timothy's eyes met his, pale and distant. "I see a building made of iron and fire, and people who think they can understand it." The train whistle echoed through the night. Harding turned back to the window, his reflection trembling against the glass. For the first time he wondered if he was taking the boy to safety, or to where the darkness wanted him to go. They arrived at Wexler Asylum under a pale morning sky, the fog rolling thick across the river valley. The building loomed above the trees like a monument to good intentions gone wrong. 3 stories of soot-stained brick, its windows narrow and barred. A tall iron gate groaned open as the carriage approached, revealing the courtyard within. Dr. Harding had visited many hospitals, yet Wexler's silence unsettled him. Even the birds avoided the roof. Inside, the corridors smelled of lime, ink, and cold metal. Gaslights hissed faintly along the walls, giving the impression that the building itself was breathing. The matron, Mrs. Elspeth Marrow, met them at the entrance, her hair pinned in a rigid bun. "You're late, Doctor," she said without warmth. "The board doesn't favour these transfers from the countryside." They seldom last long. Harding ignored the remark. "This boy is not like the others. I need your cooperation, not your opinion." Timothy stood beside him, small and immaculate in his grey coat, eyes scanning the hall. The matron glanced at him uneasily. "He's younger than we were told." "He's also sharper," Harding replied, "which may be the problem." The staff gathered to observe the new arrival. A nurse offered Timothy a biscuit, which he accepted politely but did not eat. Another asked if he missed his home. "It's still there," he said, "just in a different shape." That evening, Harding settled him into a private room on the 2nd floor. The chamber was spare but clean, iron bed, wash basin, a single window overlooking the courtyard. Timothy sat on the edge of the mattress, staring at the wall. "Do you feel safe here?" Harding asked. "Yes," the boy answered. "But they don't." "Who?" "The ones who watch through the doors." The doctor turned toward the hallway, finding it empty. When he looked back, Timothy was lying down, eyes closed, as though the exchange had never happened. By nightfall, the asylum had grown restless. The patients below murmured in their sleep, muttering unintelligible phrases that echoed faintly through the vents. Mrs. Marrow attributed it to weather pressure. Harding wasn't so sure. He spent hours at his desk writing his first Wexler entry. The boy has the composure of a scholar, the empathy of a blade. He speaks with neither deceit nor conscience. I begin to suspect that what we call evil may not always wear the face of malice, but of absence. The next morning, one of the patients, an elderly man known for his nightly hymns, was found catatonic in the chapel, whispering a single phrase over and over: "The child of smoke has come again." When Harding asked Timothy if he had visited the chapel, the boy smiled faintly, only to listen. The first week at Wexler passed without event. The boy kept to himself, polite and eerily quiet. He ate little, spoke less, and spent most of his time staring through the window at the courtyard, where the leaves gathered like rust-colored corpses in the corners of the stone wall. The staff began to relax, believing perhaps the child's calm meant recovery rather than repression. That illusion didn't last. On the seventh night, Mrs. Marrow's canary, a fragile yellow creature that filled the halls each morning with song, was found dead inside its cage. Not simply dead, but opened, its tiny chest slit cleanly down the middle with surgical precision. There was no blood, no sign of struggle, only the methodical parting of feathers and the still, glassy eyes staring upward. The matron was inconsolable. She demanded to know which patient had done it. The staff searched every room but found nothing. No tool, no trace, no guilt. When Harding asked Timothy if he'd seen anything, the boy looked up from his book and said softly, "It was curious. It wanted to see how its voice worked." The words struck the doctor like a needle through the spine. "What do you mean, it wanted?" Timothy shrugged. "Sometimes things do what they were meant to. You just have to let them finish." Later that night, one of the orderlies claimed he saw the boy walking the upper corridor long after curfew. When he tried to stop him, Timothy simply stared, and the man's lantern went out without warning. He was found hours later in the same hallway, unconscious, with burns on his hands as if from frostbite. Harding tried to rationalize it: sleepwalking, electrical faults, suggestion. Yet his own journal betrayed his certainty. An aura surrounds the boy, an atmosphere of quiet disruption. Objects seem altered after he touches them. The air grows heavier. No hysteria, no fits, only a kind of serenity that unsettles the most rational mind. The next morning, the chapel bells failed to ring for prayers. The mechanism, inspected by the caretaker, was found jammed, not by rust or rope, but by something far stranger. Every cog was packed with dead moths, wings perfectly intact, their bodies arranged in symmetrical rows as if placed there by design. When Harding entered the dining hall later that day, Timothy was there, humming softly. The tune was the same one the canary used to sing. The doctor sat opposite him. "Where did you learn that song?" Timothy smiled faintly, eyes fixed on something beyond Harding's comprehension. "It was never mine to learn. It just needed someone to remember it." Harding didn't reply. He only wrote later that evening, "The boy is not haunted. He is the haunting." By the second week, Dr. Harding resolved to treat the mystery of Timothy Vale as a scientific problem rather than a haunting. His training demanded it. He had survived battlefield amputations and epidemic wards. He refused to let a child's calm unnerve him. Thus began what his journals would later call the mirror tests. The first was simple. Harding placed a mirror before Timothy and asked him to describe what he saw. The boy tilted his head, studying the reflection with detached interest. "It looks like me," he said after a long silence. "But it isn't." "Why not?" Harding asked. "Because I don't blink when it does." Harding frowned. He watched closely and realized the boy was right. There was a split second, almost imperceptible, when Timothy's reflection seemed to lag behind. It could have been the flicker of the gaslight or a trick of fatigue, yet the image unsettled him all the same. He tried to redirect. "Do you think the boy in the mirror is good or bad?" Timothy considered. "He's neither." "He's waiting for what?" "For you to stop asking." The doctor ended the session early. That night he wrote, "There is a stillness in the child's eyes, an absence of self. His speech suggests comprehension without morality, knowledge detached from meaning." Undeterred, Harding expanded the experiments. He showed Timothy drawings of faces, joy, grief, anger, fear. The boy identified them correctly, yet when asked to mimic them, his own expressions remained hollow, mechanical. "You look happy," Harding said during one attempt. "I'm pretending," Timothy answered. "Why?" "Because that's what people do when they don't understand what they feel." Harding found himself struck by the precision of that remark. Not only the logic, but the awareness behind it. He had met adult philosophers who couldn't articulate emotion so coldly, yet he also felt an inexplicable dread, that the boy wasn't simply describing others, but him. During the third test, Harding measured Timothy's pulse while recounting violent events, the fire, the discovery of his parents. The child's heartbeat never changed. When shown the corpses of small animals, he asked only one question. "Why does it smell different when it stops being alive?" the nurses whispered behind closed doors. Some refused to enter his room. Mrs. Marrow demanded the boy be transferred to the basement infirmary, away from the others. Harding refused again. "He is a study of nature," he insisted. "We cannot learn by hiding him." But that night, he admitted in his journal, the reflection that lags behind him in the mirror, it blinked after he walked away. He crossed the line through the entry, then rewrote it slower. "Perhaps my eyes deceived me." Or perhaps deception has nothing to do with eyes. By the end of the month, Dr. Harding's fascination had shifted from study to obsession. He told himself it was science, a duty to understand what others feared, yet even he began to sense that curiosity was pulling him somewhere darker. Each evening, he would dine in his quarters and then bring Timothy a book, hoping the act might reveal something human in the boy. Instead, it only deepened the mystery. One night, Harding brought a worn copy of Pilgrim's Progress. Timothy accepted it without a word and began reading immediately. By morning, the doctor found the boy still awake, tracing a finger across a single paragraph. "What do you find interesting?" Harding asked. "The part where the man walks toward heaven but keeps looking back at hell," Timothy said. "He doesn't hate it. He just misses the noise." Harding felt a tremor beneath his composure. "You understand what that means?" The boy looked up. "I think people pretend to want goodness. But they only understand balance when something breaks it. Maybe that's what they call evil, when something stops pretending." Later that day, Harding recorded in his notes, "The child demonstrates philosophical reasoning beyond any formal instruction. His concept of morality is detached from consequence, a moral vacuum filled by curiosity alone." Timothy began to ask his own questions. Why do people fear death if they made it themselves? Why do they build churches if they don't believe what's inside them? Each question came softly, without malice, as though he were testing the boundaries of an invisible map. When Harding pressed him about his parents, Timothy answered calmly, "They were kind. They told me not to look at the fire, but I wanted to see how fast it moved when it was free." The doctor tried to rationalize it as metaphor, the confused logic of a traumatized mind, but the words lingered. That evening, Harding stood before the boy's window and saw that Timothy had arranged small pieces of paper across the glass, each marked with ink circles, perfect, identical, mathematical. When asked why, he replied, "To see how far light can go before it forgets where it started." Harding began to dream of circles, eyes, clocks, mirrors, all spinning around the same silent center. In his journal he wrote, "The more I study him, the more I sense the study turning inward. The child is not a subject but a mirror polished by intelligence, reflecting back what we fear to find in ourselves. Evil, perhaps, is not an act, but a form of understanding stripped of mercy." That night, the doctor did not sleep. The boy, however, slept soundly, smiling faintly as though pleased by something he alone could hear. As the weeks passed, word of Timothy's case reached beyond Wexler's walls. Newspapers were forbidden from printing details, yet gossip traveled faster than ink. It was said that a soulless child was being kept in the asylum, watched by a doctor who had begun to lose sleep and reason alike. Such whispers drew the attention of Reverend Jonathan Alden, a circuit preacher known for his zeal and his belief that science without God was merely organized arrogance. One grey morning, the Reverend arrived at Wexler unannounced, demanding to see the boy. Dr. Harding resisted at first, citing protocol, but Mrs. Marrow, ever eager to blame the unnatural, insisted that prayer might do what medicine could not. Reluctantly, Harding agreed. They met in the asylum's chapel, a narrow room lined with faded pews and cracked stained glass that filtered the light into a sickly green hue. Timothy sat quietly in the front row, hands folded neatly in his lap. The Reverend approached him with cautious reverence, Bible pressed tight against his chest. "Do you know why I'm here, son?" he asked. Timothy looked up, eyes as pale as old water. "To tell me about God." "Yes," Alden replied, "about the goodness that lives in all men, even in those who suffer." Timothy smiled faintly. "Then you came too late." "He's already been here." The Reverend blinked. "Who?" "God," Timothy said simply, but he didn't stay. He said he couldn't bear to watch anymore. Harding felt a chill crawl through him. Alden frowned and opened his Bible, reading aloud from the book of Job. "The Lord tests the righteous," he proclaimed, voice trembling with conviction. "He allows suffering to prove faith." The boy tilted his head. "Then why did he make me if he already knew how it would end?" Alden hesitated, eyes darting toward Harding. "You were made to be redeemed." Timothy's smile widened, though it didn't touch his eyes. What if redemption isn't the point? What if he wanted to see what would happen without it? The Reverend's voice faltered. "Blasphemy," he muttered. "No," Timothy whispered. "Observation." The chapel air grew cold. The candles flickered violently, though no wind stirred. Harding felt a pressure behind his eyes, as if the air itself were shrinking. The Reverend clutched his chest, his lips forming a silent prayer. Timothy only watched, calm and curious. By nightfall, Reverend Alden was gone, dead in his quarters, his heart stopped mid-beat. The official report listed natural causes. But Harding knew better. In his journal he wrote, "The Reverend spoke of salvation. The boy spoke of symmetry. One believed in mercy, the other in balance. Only one survived." And from that day forward, no one dared mention God in Timothy's presence again. In the weeks that followed Reverend Alden's death, Dr. Harding found his mind fraying at the edges. He stopped attending the physicians' luncheons, stopped responding to letters from the medical board, and spent his nights in the archives beneath Wexler Asylum, studying the ancient case files of so-called moral defectives. But no entry, no diagnosis, not even the most grotesque case of madness, resembled Timothy Vale. Sleep became a foreign country. When it came, it arrived in fragments, flashes of smoke, the sharp hiss of flame, and the small, steady figure of a boy standing calmly amid the fire. Harding would wake gasping, the smell of burning timber still in his nostrils. Once, when he lit his lamp, he swore he saw small fingerprints smudged into the soot on the glass, fingerprints that were not his own. He began to document his dreams in the same careful script he used for medical notes, recurring imagery of conflagration. The boy stands unburned, observing destruction with quiet satisfaction. I wake with the sense that he is not in the dream. I am. He is observing me as I burn. The line between waking and dreaming grew thinner each day. During one of his afternoon examinations, Harding caught himself staring at Timothy longer than intended. The boy noticed and asked, "Are you trying to see what I am, or what you're not?" Harding recoiled slightly. "You're a child." That's all. Timothy's tone was soft. "Then why do you write about me like a reflection?" Harding had no answer. He ended the session early, yet that night he dreamed again. The same fire, the same quiet boy. Only this time, the boy spoke. "You keep calling me evil," the voice said from the flames, "but you're the one who wants to understand me." The next morning, Harding's hand shook as he wrote, "It is possible I have transferred my own doubt onto the patient. If so, then his calm is not demonic, it is diagnostic. He reveals our limits, not his. But even as he tried to believe that strange events multiplied, lamps extinguished without cause, instruments misplaced only to reappear in impossible places, the temperature of Timothy's room dropped so sharply that frost formed on the inside of the glass, though the furnace roared below. When Harding confronted him, the boy simply said, "Sometimes the cold keeps things from spreading." The doctor stared at him. "Spreading?" Timothy looked toward the wall. "The fire. It never really stops. It just waits until someone else learns how to light it again." That night, Harding didn't sleep at all. He sat by the window until dawn, watching the chimney stacks exhale pale ribbons of smoke into a sky the color of bruised porcelain. Dr. Harding's journal entries began to change in tone. What had once been the disciplined notes of a physician turned into pages filled with unease and fragmented reflections. He could not stop thinking about the boy, his eyes, his stillness, the quiet certainty that seemed to swallow every question Harding asked. What began as a study of pathology had become an experiment on the doctor himself. He convinced the board to allow him extended, unsupervised sessions with Timothy. He claimed it was for observation, but even he knew it was something else, a compulsion to understand. Each night he devised new tests, pulse measurements during emotional stimuli, response tracking to sensory deprivation, exposure to pain, and temperature fluctuation. Nothing changed. Timothy's pulse never wavered. His breathing remained steady, his gaze calm, even when the experiments turned cruel. "Pain," Harding told him one evening, "teaches us who we are." The boy's voice was steady. "Then you must know yourself better than anyone." Harding froze. The words stung not for their insolence, but for their truth. He had spent his life watching men bleed and break, believing that through suffering the soul revealed itself. Yet this child, this anomaly, rendered the very idea meaningless. In his next journal entry, the doctor wrote, "The subject's indifference to pain is not numbness but comprehension. He perceives pain as function, not consequence. In his logic, agony and curiosity are the same. To him, all acts are experiments." Weeks passed. Harding began sleeping in his office, surrounded by the scent of ink and carbolic acid. He no longer trusted the staff's reports, believing they misinterpreted the boy's behavior through fear or superstition. He saw something purer in Timothy. Terrible, yes, but uncorrupted by pretense. The nurses whispered that the doctor was falling under the child's spell. Harding dismissed it as hysteria, though even he noticed his handwriting had changed, sharper, more deliberate, almost like Timothy's. Late one night, Harding entered the boy's room without lighting the lamp. Timothy was awake, sitting upright in bed, as if waiting. "Do you dream, doctor?" the boy asked softly. "Not anymore," Harding replied. Timothy tilted his head. "You will." Soon the doctor's breath caught. "And what will I dream of?" "The answer," Timothy said, "but you won't like what it looks like." Harding left without responding, but the words clung to him. In his next entry, he admitted what he had not dared before. "My objectivity is lost." I feel drawn toward him, not as physician to patient, but as pupil to master. He teaches through silence what I cannot learn through reason. For the first time in his career, Dr. Harding stopped signing his journal as observer. He began signing it simply witness. Winter pressed its weight upon Wexler Asylum, bringing long nights and the smell of damp stone through the corridors. The lamps burned lower, and the air in the patient wings seemed colder no matter how fiercely the furnaces roared. It was during this season of stillness that Nurse Abigail Whitlow vanished. She had been one of the few who showed Timothy kindness. Each evening she brought him warm milk and a folded blanket, tucking it neatly beneath his chin as though he were any other child. "Everyone deserves warmth," she once told Harding. But warmth had a way of dying quickly around Timothy Vale. On the night of December 11th, Whitlow was last seen descending the stairwell to the east ward with a lantern in hand. She never returned. The next morning, the lantern was found extinguished halfway down the stairs, its glass unbroken. In Timothy's room, her rosary lay upon the nightstand, the beads fused into the wax of a candle that had burned itself down to nothing. When confronted, Timothy seemed puzzled by the commotion. "She was afraid," he said calmly. "She wanted to know if the dark was different on the other side of the walls." Harding demanded details. "Did you speak with her last night?" "Yes," the boy said. "She asked if I pray. I told her I don't need to. Prayer is just a wish with manners." Harding pressed harder. "Did she leave your room?" Timothy's eyes flicked toward the window. "Not yet." The words chilled the doctor. He searched the courtyard himself, boots crunching in the thin snow. There were no footprints, no signs of a struggle. only the echo of the wind through the chimney stacks, sounding almost like a woman's hum. That evening, Mrs. Marrow accused Harding of negligence, even complicity. "You've let that child infect this place," she hissed. "Your precious studies have turned to rot." Harding said nothing. He only returned to his quarters and opened his journal. The entry began calm, clinical. Nurse Whitlow missing. No evidence of foul play. But as the lines continued, the handwriting grew erratic. Something has shifted. The boy's presence stretches beyond his body. Objects near him seem to bend toward his silence. Perhaps absence itself is contagious. When he looked up from the page, the candle beside him flickered and went out. For a moment, the darkness in the room seemed thicker than natural, as though it had a texture, something he could almost touch. And then, faintly, from the corridor beyond his door, came the sound of humming. It was Nurse Whitlow's song. Harding never found the source. But in the morning, when he opened Timothy's door, the boy was awake, sitting cross-legged on the bed, his hands folded neatly in his lap. "I told her the dark would listen," he said. The disappearance of Nurse Whitlow marked a turning point, not just for Wexler Asylum, but for Dr. Harding himself. What had once been whispered suspicions now erupted into outright accusation. The Board of Governors sent inspectors from Pittsburgh, men of pressed coats and colder hearts, demanding Harding relinquish the boy for transfer to state custody. The word transfer was a euphemism. Everyone knew it meant confinement, isolation, and eventually erasure. Harding resisted. "You cannot bury what you do not understand," he told them. "Timothy Vale is not a danger to others, only a revelation of what lies dormant in ourselves." The inspectors exchanged glances, the kind that carry silent verdicts. One of them, a portly man named Dr. Lowell, leaned forward. "A revelation, you say?" "Doctor, 3 deaths, 1 disappearance, and the asylum itself in disarray. And you call this revelation?" Harding's voice broke into something between fury and pleading. "He's not possessed. He's pure. You call it evil because it doesn't fit your theology, but if evil is simply nature stripped of conscience, then what is the child except nature perfected?" The meeting ended in outrage. Mrs. Marrow resigned that very night, claiming she would not serve a house that harbored the devil. Many of the staff followed. By the end of the week, half the asylum was deserted, the remaining patients tended by skeleton crews. Harding alone remained steadfast, refusing to let the boy be taken. In the nights that followed, strange noises echoed through the empty halls, the tapping of small fingers on glass, the sound of doors unlocking themselves. The few nurses who remained claimed to see the child walking the corridors in 2 places at once, his shadow outpacing him. Harding dismissed it as hysteria, born of guilt. Yet when he reviewed the night guard's reports, he found an entry that froze his blood. Room 12 empty at midnight, subject later seen entering room 12 from the opposite hall. Timothy remained polite, even gentle in the doctor's presence, but his words grew more pointed. "They're afraid of what doesn't need reason," he said one evening, "but you're not. You just want to name it. Harding's journal from that week is nearly illegible, words scratched over words, ink soaked through the paper. Society fears what it cannot own. They'll destroy him for the comfort of their ignorance. If they succeed, they'll never know what they killed, or how many more like him are yet to come." By month's end, the inspectors returned with orders to seize the child. But Wexler's gates never opened for them. The locks jammed, the main door refused its key, and inside, the halls echoed with the soft sound of a child laughing. With the asylum now half empty, and its corridors echoing with the sighs of wind through hollow halls, Timothy Vale seemed to flourish. His calm deepened into something almost regal, as if solitude itself nourished him. Dr. Harding, despite everything, continued his experiments, though he had stopped calling them that in his journal. Now he referred to them as conversations with curiosity. It began innocently. Harding would bring Timothy small objects, pins, insects, glass marbles, and watch how he reacted. The boy never destroyed anything in anger, but rather dismantled them with precision, like a craftsman studying the secret structure of the world. He once took apart a pocket watch piece by piece and reassembled it perfectly, but backward. When Harding asked him why, Timothy answered, "To see if time still works when it's reversed." Soon the objects changed, no longer toys or trinkets, but living things. A wounded rabbit from the garden, a sparrow caught in the rafters. Timothy observed each with fascination. "Everything wants to stop," he said softly as the rabbit twitched in his hands. "It's just waiting for permission." Harding tried to intervene, but the boy's calm unnerved him more than the act itself. When it was over, Timothy wiped his fingers on a cloth and whispered, "Now it's quiet again." Harding's moral compass began to erode. His scientific detachment twisted into complicity. He justified it to himself in endless ways, for research, for truth, for progress. Yet deep down, he knew he was watching not a child, but a philosophy made flesh. His notes from this period were erratic. Observation without empathy breeds clarity. The boy does not kill for cruelty, but for curiosity. And curiosity, unchecked by conscience, is the engine of creation itself. Even the asylum's few remaining staff began to notice. One night, the groundskeeper burst into Harding's office, pale and shaking, insisting he'd seen the boy in the courtyard, standing motionless beneath a lightning storm, hair lifted by static, eyes open wide toward the sky. "He was smiling," the man said, "like he was waiting for it to strike him." When Harding confronted Timothy the next day, the boy looked up from his desk and replied calmly, "It did." But only a little. He held out his hands. The doctor saw faint red lines across his palms, like the veins of a leaf burned into the flesh. That night, Harding could not write. He simply stared at the candlelight and whispered to himself, "He is not learning from me. I am learning from him." Outside, thunder rolled again over the asylum, as if the sky itself had begun to take notes. January brought snow that refused to stay white. The soot from Wexler's chimneys stained it grey, and the wind carried the scent of smoke even on clear days. To Dr. Harding, it was as though the asylum itself had begun to breathe differently, exhaling reminders of something that had never truly gone out. He wrote fewer notes now, and when he did, they read more like prayers than reports. "The boy's calm grows heavier," one entry began. "It is not silence anymore, but gravity. The air bends around him. The lamps burn lower in his presence, as if light itself concedes Timothy spent his days sketching in charcoal, circles, spirals, endless lines that always returned to their starting point." Harding noticed that each drawing seemed to hum faintly when touched, though no sound should have been possible. He asked what they meant, and the boy replied, "They're the shapes fire makes before it starts." That night, the doctor dreamed of the Vale farmhouse again, but this time he stood inside it. The walls were breathing, expanding with each pulse of the child's steady gaze. When he woke, his bedsheets reeked of ash. The next morning, one of the few remaining orderlies came running into his office. "Doctor, the boiler room, it's happening again." Harding followed him down the narrow stairwell, the iron handrail freezing cold beneath his grip. The smell of burning oil filled the air. The boiler's gauges spun wildly, steam shrieking through its pipes. Yet when he entered the room, Timothy was already there, standing barefoot on the wet stone floor, staring into the furnace. "Who brought you here?" Harding demanded. "No one," the boy said. "It called me." "Step away, Timothy." The child turned his head slowly, the faint light from the furnace flickering in his eyes. "It's beautiful," he whispered, "the way it eats and never feels full." Harding reached for him, but the heat became unbearable. The flames inside the boiler flared, then drew inward as though inhaling. For a moment, the fire seemed to vanish entirely, leaving only a deep, throbbing glow. Then, without warning, the furnace door burst open, casting a wave of heat through the room. When the chaos subsided, the boy was untouched. Harding's coat was singed, his skin blistered, yet Timothy stood calm amid the embers. "It doesn't want me," the boy said. "It remembers me." That night, Harding wrote only one sentence before sleep claimed him. "The fire has learned to wait." And though the boiler was repaired by morning, The staff swore that for hours afterward, faint laughter could be heard echoing through the pipes, soft, childlike, and terribly patient. By February, Dr. Harding no longer pretended his research was for science. His journals, once filled with careful handwriting and measured thought, had become chaotic, ink blots, unfinished sentences, pages torn away. His reflection in the mirror had begun to look unfamiliar, the dark circles beneath his eyes, the grey creeping into his beard, and something else, something cold watching back from within. He found himself speaking to the boy less as a physician, more as a man trying to reason with a storm. He entered Timothy's room one evening, the air heavy with that familiar chill. The boy sat at his desk, carving small lines into the wooden surface with a scalpel Harding didn't remember giving him. "You shouldn't have that," the doctor said quietly. "I didn't take it," Timothy replied. "It was already here." Harding looked closer and saw that the markings weren't random. They were letters, or something like them, patterns repeating in a spiral. "What does it say?" he asked. The boy smiled faintly. "It says what you already know." "Which is?" "That I'm not the one being studied anymore." Something in Harding's chest tightened. "You think you understand me?" Timothy's tone was soft, almost kind. "I don't have to. You're doing it for me." Harding slammed his notebook shut. "You speak in riddles. You twist meaning until it bleeds. I will not indulge your games any longer." The boy tilted his head. "You don't believe that." Silence filled the room. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks in the windows, and somewhere deep in the asylum, a door slammed on its own. Harding forced himself to steady his voice. "Tell me, Timothy, do you ever feel remorse? Do you ever think of those who died because of you?" The boy's eyes met his, clear and unflinching. "You think I killed them?" "You were there. Every time." "Then maybe it's you," Timothy said. "Maybe I only happen where you go." The words rooted Harding to the spot. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. "You're suggesting I'm not suggesting," the boy interrupted. "I'm remembering." Harding stepped back. "You're lying." Timothy's smile never wavered. "I don't need to. You already feel it, don't you? The warmth in your hands when you write about me. The way your heart beats faster when I speak. You think you're observing evil, Doctor, but you're practicing it." Harding left abruptly, his footsteps echoing down the corridor like hammer blows. He didn't return to his office but to the chapel, where he fell to his knees before the cracked altar. In his trembling hands, his journal lay open to a fresh page. He wrote only 3 words before closing it again. "He's becoming me." The storm began without warning. On the night of March 2nd, the skies above Wexler Asylum tore open with wind and thunder so violent it seemed the heavens themselves had grown restless. The power flickered once, twice, and then died completely, leaving only the dim glow of lanterns and the trembling pulse of lightning through the halls. The few remaining staff huddled together in the main ward, praying the storm would pass. Dr. Harding, however, felt something else in the air, not panic, but inevitability. He knew the pattern by now: quiet, escalation, release. He followed the flickering light of his lantern through the corridors toward Timothy's room, the sound of his own footsteps swallowed by the growing roar outside. When he reached the 2nd floor, he found the door already open. Inside, the boy sat on the edge of the bed, calm as a saint in a storm. Papers littered the floor, covered in those same spiral markings, black ink bleeding into the grain of the wood like veins. "Did you do this?" Harding asked, his voice trembling. Timothy looked up. "It was already happening. You just finally caught up." "Enough," the doctor snapped. "No more riddles. No more games. Tell me what you are." The boy tilted his head. "You already named me once. Anomaly of creation, wasn't it?" Harding stepped forward. "You killed them all? The nurse, the reverend, your parents." "I didn't kill anyone," Timothy said softly. "They killed themselves trying to understand me." Lightning flashed through the window, and for a moment the room seemed to warp. Shadows bending inward, air thickening like water. The sound of locks clattering echoed down the hall. Doors were opening one by one. Patients began to scream. Harding rushed to the window, and through the sheets of rain he saw movement in the courtyard, figures wandering barefoot through the mud, faces turned skyward as if in trance. The asylum was no longer an institution, it was awakening. He turned back to Timothy. "Stop this!" "I'm not doing anything," the boy whispered. "They're hearing it now too." "Hearing what?" "The part that's always been there." A sudden crash reverberated through the building, a wall collapsing, the sound of stone splitting. The lantern shattered in Harding's hand, plunging the room into near darkness. And in that darkness, a glow began to bloom around the boy, faint and colourless, like the last breath of a dying fire. Harding stumbled backward. "What are you?" Timothy rose to his feet, the light pulsing softly in his chest. The beginning that forgot to end. The doctor tried to reach for him, but the air turned hot and silent. Then came the sound, not of thunder, but of laughter, rippling through the walls, small and endless, like the echo of a child set free. When morning came, Wexler Asylum was nothing but smoke and rubble. When rescue crews reached the ruins of Wexler Asylum 3 days later, the fires were still smouldering beneath the collapsed walls. The storm had passed, leaving the valley drowned in silence. Dozens of bodies were found, some burned, some crushed, and others seemingly untouched, their expressions frozen in eerie tranquility. The official report would later call it a structural failure exacerbated by lightning, but the survivors told another story, one filled with whispers and contradictions. They said the locks had opened themselves, that the fire had moved against the wind, that a boy had been seen walking through the smoke, barefoot and unburned. Dr. Edwin Harding was among the few pulled from the wreckage alive, though just barely. His hands were scorched, his lungs blackened with soot. For 2 weeks, he drifted in and out of delirium, calling out the same words over and over. "The child is not gone. The child is not gone." He was transferred to St. Mary's Infirmary in Pittsburgh, where he was confined to a private room for his own recovery and the comfort of others. The nurses who tended to him described his condition as peculiar. He could not bear to be near mirrors, and every night before sleep he covered the lamps with cloth, muttering, "Light invites him in." The asylum's Board of Governors issued an immediate closure of the Wexler facility. All research materials, including Harding's journals, were ordered destroyed. But one attendant, an intern named Jonathan Hale, disobeyed. He salvaged the doctor's writings from the ashes and hid them in his trunk, too intrigued by the madness within to let them perish. In those journals, Harding's transformation was complete. The final entries were no longer reports of observation, but confessions. It was not the child who corrupted me, but the clarity he offered. I see now that morality is not a shield against evil. It is its disguise. When empathy fades, logic remains, and logic without love burns everything it touches. The handwriting grew frantic in later pages, slanting upward as though written in haste. He showed me the truth, that evil needs no master, only a witness, and I was the perfect one. By the time spring arrived, Harding was gone. Some claimed he escaped through a window during a rainstorm, others said his heart failed during the night. But the staff who found his bed empty swore the smell of smoke lingered for days afterward, though no candle had burned. The only thing left behind was a single line scratched into the plaster beside his bed, written in ash. "Fire does not die. It moves." Dr. Edwin Harding was presumed dead in the spring of 1869, but 5 years later, in a mining town 200 miles west of Pittsburgh, a gaunt man matching his description appeared at a boarding house under the name Edward Harrow. He carried no luggage, only a leather satchel filled with yellowed papers and a fountain pen with a cracked nib. The innkeeper, recognizing the name from old newspapers, sent word to a local journalist who had once written about the Wexler fire. That journalist, Thomas Avery, travelled 3 days to meet him. He later described Harding's appearance in an article never published. The man looked hollowed out, as if the soul had been scraped clean and only the echo remained. They met in the dim corner of the boarding house parlour. Harding, his hair gone white, his eyes clouded and fever-bright, spoke in a voice soft but steady. Avery began with courtesy, then pressed for truth. "Dr. Harding, there are men who say you lost your mind in that asylum. Others claim you uncovered something unspeakable. Which is it?" The doctor smiled faintly. "Both." Avery leaned closer. "Was the boy real?" Harding's fingers trembled on the armrest. "You mean, is he gone?" "Yes." The doctor's gaze drifted toward the window, where evening shadows crept across the floor. "He was never gone. I think he was never here to begin with. I think he was the shape of something we've all carried, the quiet part of reason that feels nothing as it cuts." "Then what happened that night?" Avery asked. "The asylum burned," Harding said simply, "but not because of the storm." "It burned because fire remembers its maker," Avery frowned. "You mean the boy—" "Not the boy," Harding interrupted. "The idea of him. Evil isn't a presence, it's an inheritance." The silence stretched. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows like a restless breath. Avery wrote quickly, his hand trembling. "And you?" he asked. "What became of you, Doctor?" Harding's smile vanished. "I thought I had survived him. But lately, when I look at my reflection, I see him studying me." Avery hesitated. "You think he lives in you?" Harding shook his head slowly. "No. I think I was always him, and he just reminded me." The journalist ended the interview soon after, unnerved by the doctor's calm. That night, Harding died quietly in his room, sitting upright in his chair. His last words, overheard by the innkeeper, were a whisper carried on a trembling breath. "He's learning to smile." The next morning, the chair in which Harding had died was found warm to the touch, though the fire had long since gone out. In 1895, more than a quarter century after the Wexler fire, renovation work began on the ruins that once housed the asylum. The land had long been avoided by locals, who claimed the soil smelled wrong after rain. When labourers began clearing the debris, they discovered a rusted lockbox buried beneath the charred foundation of what had been Dr. Harding's office. Inside, wrapped in water-stained linen, were 3 leather-bound journals and several brittle pages of correspondence addressed to the Pennsylvania Medical Board, none of which had ever been sent. The documents were transferred to the University Archives in Philadelphia, where a young psychology professor named Dr. Martin Kellard took an interest. The late Victorian era had made psychiatry fashionable, and the rediscovery of Harding's case promised prestige. The press called it the Lost Journals of the Wexler Doctor. For weeks, Kellard and his assistants worked to decipher the smoke-damaged handwriting. The early entries were methodical, clinical, detached. But as the pages continued, the tone changed, logic giving way to obsession, observation to reverence. Harding's transformation unfolded line by line until the reader could feel the descent as though walking beside him. "Timothy Vale," one entry read, "is not a patient but a principle. He exists as the remainder after empathy is subtracted." Nature's control experiment for the absence of soul. Kellard dismissed the later passages as psychotic breaks, classic signs of exhaustion and trauma. Yet his colleagues noted his growing fascination. He began lecturing on Harding's philosophical illness, describing it as the most profound example of pathological rationalism in medical history. Then came the disturbances. Pages went missing from the archives, only to reappear days later in different drawers. Ink from the journals bled into clean paper left nearby, creating faint mirror images of the text. One assistant resigned after claiming to hear a child's laughter echoing through the closed stacks. Kellard pressed on. He claimed to have identified what he called the Vale pattern, a recurring sequence of words, symbols, and phrases in the journals that formed an intricate code. He believed Harding had embedded something within the text, a message concealed under layers of obsession. When his colleagues reviewed the pattern, they noticed something chilling. The symbols weren't random. They resembled the spirals and circles found carved into the wood of Harding's desk after the fire, identical down to the smallest detail. The university officially sealed the journals in April of 1896, citing preservation concerns. Kellard objected vehemently. A week later, his office was found abandoned, his notes scattered, his chair still rocking. He was never seen again. The only thing recovered was a torn scrap of paper on his desk, written in hurried pencil, "He doesn't die in fire." He moves through those who try to read him. By the dawn of the 20th century, the story of Timothy Vale had become a rumor dressed as folklore, whispered among physicians, retold in rural taverns, printed occasionally in the margins of psychology journals as an odd curiosity. Yet every few decades, a pattern emerged that felt hauntingly familiar. In 1903, a child in Massachusetts was reported to have dissected small animals to see how silence worked. In 1911, a boy in New Orleans was accused of pushing his brother into a well, later explaining to police, "I wanted to know how long remembering lasts underwater." None of these cases were linked officially, but each shared a single unnerving detail. The children all had the same pale, almost translucent eyes, and all were born in the winter months following great fires. By 1922, doctors began to classify a new psychological anomaly they called Vale syndrome, an informal name borrowed from Harding's journals, circulated quietly in medical circles. The symptoms were consistent: above-average intelligence, emotional detachment, absence of empathy, and a fascination with the mechanisms of pain. No genetic markers, no identifiable trauma. It appeared, as one physician put it, as if reason itself had shed its skin. Public interest flared again after a series of killings in Chicago in 1931, where the perpetrator, a 13-year-old boy named Henry Lowell, was found drawing spirals on the walls of his cell using soot from the gas lamps. When questioned about his motives, he smiled and said, "The doctor told me to finish what he started." No doctor was ever identified. Across the years, researchers noticed other anomalies. Children born on the same day the Wexler ruins were disturbed. Entire families reporting shared dreams of fire and silence. Letters to universities claiming to hear a boy humming through the pipes. Of course, such reports were dismissed as hysteria, but the coincidences multiplied until even the skeptics stopped laughing. In 1954, the American Journal of Psychiatry published a single-line correction after an article on sociopathy. Cases historically linked to the Vale manuscripts remain unverified, but ongoing, the correction was later deleted from the archive. Even now, the name Timothy Vale occasionally surfaces, not in textbooks, but in unmarked folders, hospital logs, and transcripts that vanish from databases without explanation. The legend endures because it never quite feels like one. Some say evil evolves as knowledge does, not in the supernatural, but in the clinical. Not in monsters, but in children who look too long into the workings of the world and see no reason to stop. And though no living person can claim to have seen Timothy Vale again, there are still reports, faint, scattered, persistent, of a boy with colorless eyes walking through the ruins of forgotten institutions, smiling as if remembering something that never truly ended. By the late 20th century, the legend of Timothy Vale had shifted from history to hypothesis. Psychologists debated whether the tale represented an allegory of human detachment or a hidden lineage of pathology. But those who read Harding's surviving journals knew that the question went far deeper, not into medicine, but into meaning itself. Harding had once written, "Evil is not an act, nor a presence. It is efficiency without empathy." That phrase became the seed for a century of philosophical discourse. Scholars dissected it, theologians condemned it, and scientists tried to erase it. Yet, for every attempt to rationalize or bury his words, more evidence surfaced of their truth. In one of his final notes, recovered from the margins of a burnt ledger, Harding had written something else, something rarely quoted. "If humanity defines good as restraint, then curiosity is its original sin." Those who studied his work began to see the reflection of their own time in his warning. Wars fought with clinical precision, progress built on cold calculation, machines making decisions without conscience. Everywhere, the boundaries between curiosity and cruelty blurred. The more humanity learned, the less it felt. Timothy Vale had never been a prophecy, but a mirror, showing, in miniature, what the species might become when intellect outpaces compassion. And the more the world advanced, the more the mirror seemed to fit. In 1979, a conference on the ethics of artificial sentience opened with a quote attributed to Harding. It read, "We cannot teach morality to what was born without it." The speaker, a neuroscientist from Zurich, went on to suggest that modern cognitive systems shared the same mechanical innocence as Timothy Vale. The audience laughed politely, yet a recording of that lecture captured an anomaly: faint, rhythmic tapping behind the podium, perfectly spaced, like the sound of a child knocking on glass. No one noticed it until playback. Years later, philosophers would call Harding's writings the anatomy of denial. His tragedy lay not in what he discovered, but in what he proved: that evil does not require the supernatural, it only requires the absence of interference. Every institution that tried to study Timothy, church, court, asylum, university, failed for the same reason. They believed that morality was a structure strong enough to contain the dark. Harding's journals revealed the opposite. Morality is a thin fabric stretched across something vast and unfeeling, and sometimes, under the right conditions, it tears. In that tear, Timothy Vale was born, not as a monster, but as a moment in human history when knowledge learned to look at itself and smile. In the spring of 1901, long before the legend had faded into rumor, an archivist at the Allegheny Historical Society catalogued a series of glass negatives recovered from a photographer's estate. Most were unremarkable: portraits of mill workers, landscapes of the river valley, and one damaged exposure labeled Wexler House, 1871. The asylum had already burned 2 years earlier, so the date made little sense. Still, the archivist decided to restore it, curious about what image might survive beneath the soot and scratches. What emerged from the restoration became one of the most debated photographs in American folklore. The image showed the charred remains of Wexler's west wing, skeletal beams silhouetted against the sky. In the foreground, standing beside a fractured column, was a small boy, barefoot, pale, smiling faintly. His eyes, though blurred by exposure, seemed unnaturally light, almost glowing. Experts argued over the authenticity for decades. Some claimed it was a double exposure, others insisted the figure was merely a trick of the light. Yet the more the image was studied, the stranger it became. In 1934, when technology allowed deeper analysis, restorers discovered something the naked eye had missed. Within the photograph's emulsion, faint concentric circles, tiny spiral markings, appeared around the boy's feet, etched not by damage, but as part of the original negative. The archivist who discovered them, a man named Edwin Harding, resigned a week later. In his final report he wrote, "There are shapes here that are not photographic. They are carved in light." He burned his notes and left the society without collecting his pay. The image was locked away for 50 years. When it resurfaced in 1956 during a museum exhibit on post-war photography, its accompanying plaque identified the subject only as unknown child, circa 1870. Visitors reported feeling ill at ease near the display. Some claimed the boy's faint smile seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. A few swore the temperature in the room dropped as they approached. The photograph was removed from public view within a month after a guard collapsed during his shift, suffering burns on his hands despite no source of heat nearby. Officially, the incident was ruled a stress-induced episode. To this day, the original glass plate remains sealed in the museum's archives, marked under restricted access. Copies that surface online are always distorted, blurry, inverted, or missing entirely after a few hours. No one agrees on whether the boy in the picture was Timothy Vale or merely someone who resembled him. But one detail is certain. The negative bears a date etched into the corner by hand. Not 1871 as once believed, but 1868, the same year the Vale farmhouse burned. And under that date, scratched faintly in the glass, a single word: remember. The photograph was only the beginning. It reawakened questions long buried, and with them came a pattern that stretched beyond coincidence. In the decades that followed, fragments of Harding's journals surfaced across the world, snippets of handwriting that appeared in private collections, auction catalogues, even inside the margins of unrelated books. Experts confirmed the ink, the age, even the phrasing, but not the possibility. How could papers lost in the Wexler fire appear in places they had never been sent? Each fragment carried the same symbol, a spiral, always drawn in a single unbroken motion, always ending with a dot at the center. When placed together, the fragments formed a design resembling both an eye and a vortex. No one agreed on its meaning. Some called it a cipher, others a map. But those who studied it too long reported the same symptoms: sleeplessness, the smell of smoke, and the faint sound of a child's voice whispering just beyond the range of understanding. By the mid-century, the legend of Timothy Vale was dismissed by scholars as moral folklore, a cautionary myth against human arrogance. Yet in quiet corners of academia, there remained those who believed the story was not metaphor but memory. One of them, historian Eleanor Raines, published a banned essay in 1968 titled "The Persistence of Innocent Evil." In it, she wrote, "We have tried to classify him, to diagnose him, to bury him in language. But evil does not die when named. It multiplies through the mouths that speak it." 3 months after publication, her house burned to the ground. Her typewriter was found fused to the desk, the last line in the carriage reading simply, "He's awake again." And so the tale survived, adapting like a contagion through every generation that tried to explain it. A boy who did not age, a fire that never ended, a scientist who mistook curiosity for salvation. Each retelling reshaped the same truth, that what humanity calls evil may not be moral at all, but mechanical, a flawless design without the burden of empathy. The last of Harding's recovered notes, authenticated in 1982, contained no analysis, no reasoning, no defense, just a single observation written in a steady, resigned hand. Perhaps Timothy was never a boy. Perhaps he was the name we gave to what lives in all of us when the warmth runs out. Today, no one knows where the journals rest or whether they even still exist. Some claim they were sealed in a private collection. Others say they burned again, taking their secrets with them. But every few years, somewhere in the world, a new copy surfaces, its paper unaged, its ink still fresh, and on the first page, beneath Harding's signature, the same faint word appears, written in a child's hand: "Continue." If evil were a person, history would have buried him. But evil doesn't need a body, only memory. The tale of Timothy Vale endures because it was never about a child. It was about what we become when conscience sleeps and curiosity stays awake. Dr. Harding believed he was studying a phenomenon, a crack in nature's design. In truth, he was documenting something timeless, the slow unmaking of empathy in the name of reason. The deeper he looked, the more he saw himself reflected in the child's eyes, calm, brilliant, and utterly detached. That, perhaps, was the real horror, not the boy, but the recognition. Every age has its Timothys. Some wear lab coats, some wear suits, some wear smiles that never reach their eyes. They build, they innovate, they justify. They call it progress. And all the while the quiet fire moves, through institutions, through inventions, through the spaces where compassion should have been. Harding's final words, though dismissed as madness, read less like confession and more like prophecy. We thought we could teach morality to the world. But the world has been teaching us something older, that the mind, once freed from mercy, does not stop. It only waits for another name. There are those who say that somewhere, in the ruins of Wexler House, a faint light still flickers on winter nights. That if you stand close enough, you might hear the hum of a child's tune carried on the cold air. No one has ever found the source, but every generation, someone claims to have seen him, not as a ghost, but as a presence behind the glass, watching quietly, patient as ever. Maybe Timothy Vale was never meant to be understood. Maybe he was only meant to be remembered, a warning carved into the fabric of reason itself. Because the question Harding failed to answer still lingers, uncomfortably alive. Is evil born or made? And if it can be born, then perhaps it can be born again, not in fire, but in thought. So if this story has reached you tonight, if you felt the chill of its truth behind the words, remember what Dr. Harding could not. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved. They only want to be witnessed. Before you go, if tales like this one keep you staring a little longer into the dark, wondering what watches back, stay with us. Subscribe to the Macabre Record channel for more journeys into the forgotten corners of history, where fact and fear walk side by side. And in the comments below, tell us, do you believe evil is born or made? Until next time, keep your lamps lit and if you hear humming in the silence, don't answer.